Let's talk about crypto bros getting shot, and why that's good. In a book. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just books, but one book in specific, and one book that you probably haven't heard about because for some reason or other it kinda completely failed to get anyone's notice. I am talking about Ian McDonald's new novel, Hopeland, which came out earlier this year, and so far no one on BookTube has talked about it. And there's literally just two reviews that I could find on Google outside of Goodreads, and I think that's a shame. So I'm going to do the thing, which is go fucking buy and read that book. It's worth it. We'll be talking about it in detail. There will be spoilers, but I'll give you a free, spoiler-free, quick synopsis of what to expect and why to go and buy it. And then we'll talk about why it is, well, so far one of the best novels of 2023. For me, and hopefully for you too. And we'll see where that goes. So, buckle up and, also go and get Hopeland by Ian McDonald. Alright, so what is Hopeland by Ian McDonald? It is a book, well, about climate change, sort of. It's a book about how we deal with it, sort of. It's a book about all the things we should probably not do. It's also a book about, possible ways of finding or forming society in a way that makes us more resilient and gives us the ability of continuing. In that regard, it is very much like a book written by one Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry for the Future, but it does have a more personal aspect. It looks more to individual humans. It also does have a bit more of a good plot, to be fair, and good characters, which, might be something you can find in, say, a novel set like Terminal Shock Termination Shock by Neil Stephenson, without all the, tech billionaires will save us bullshit that Neil Stephenson is constantly falling into because he's a libertarian. It does also look at very specific, underground subcultures in a way that you might find in a William Gibson novel of the early 2000s, like Pattern Recognition, Spook Country, or Zero History. And it mixes all of these things with one thing that Ian McDonald is better than almost every other science fiction author I've ever read, which is an incredible sense of place, no matter which place he's talking about. If he's talking about London, London feels fucking real. If he's talking about Ireland, Ireland feels fucking real. If he's talking about Iceland, Iceland feels fucking real. If he's talking about Polynesian islands, those feel fucking real. It's his skill. It's his unique talent, beyond just, being a brilliant writer, knowing how to use words in general. And it does all of that in a large story about different families coming together, falling apart. It has thousands of individual bits and pieces that all come together into a wonderful story about where we might be heading in the next 10 years. It starts in 2011, it ends in 2033, and between that, we'll find out where the world is going. That's what you get. It's a climate change novel, it's a family saga, it's so much more, and it's all brilliant, and you should definitely go and read it, because it's actually sort of hopeful and positive. And, the world being what it is these days, and our politicians being as brilliant as ever when it comes to combating climate change, we all might need some hope. And, we can learn something from it. Also, crypto bros getting shot, as I said, which is good. So, there you are. Go read the book. It's worth it. I can not recommend it any higher. It's probably the best thing I've read this year. And, you do that, and then we'll talk about why I think it's so brilliant in some spoiler-filled discussions of themes and structure and all the other good bits. All right, so why do I think the book works so incredibly well and does all the things that it does so well? Well, as I said, it's a typical Ian McDonald in that regard, that it does go into all kinds of different aspects of human existence, human life, and so forth, and ties them all together into where we're going. And the term that he uses for this one, or the metaphor that he uses for this story, is mostly the one of stars or constellations. And it's important that he says constellations, because that means a web of stars. And in fact, sometimes he does even talk about other forms of webs when we're talking about the image of creating a new forest in Iceland, that I think are important here. See, one thing that we all need to figure out is how do we make ourselves as a species more reliant and more resilient, because things are getting more and more crazy. And that's a good question. And one aspect of that is, well, the idea of building more, well, webs of relations, webs and constellations of relations, because then we can, build up pressure or soak up pressure and so forth. It's something that you find in all kinds of, social sciences, even in physics and so forth. And Ian McDonald does take that as sort of the, well, structure almost of the novel on several layers. It is the story itself, which has all these individual bits and pieces that are slowly connected to all kinds of other groups, these small bits of a plot here and bits of a plot there, and throughout the novel they build more of like a web or like a constellation of smaller events that still, when you step back, reveal a larger whole. So we have that, and then we obviously have, well, the family of Hopelands, which are exactly that kind of thing. A family that is, well, built of, or maybe even a micronation, you never quite know, a group of people that are all connected through these family ties, which can be tightened or loosened as required, and that span the globe. And that's like the next layer. We have these family bonds, which can be interpreted, if you, well, do family in that specific way, as, well, another web that is more resilient than all kinds of other social ties, like, citizenship in a nation, for example, which, well, nations kind of suck, as we know, and we'll find out in this book again and again. So we have that other layer. Then we obviously have, well, as I already mentioned, the trees, the forest that Raisa is building in Iceland, or growing in Iceland. And we'll see at the beginning, right, she starts building or growing that forest by sowing them in a very specific grid pattern and everything, which is actually constructing it, and that fails. So it does actually do the right thing, which is just let the forest grow wild in the way that a forest grows naturally, which once again gives us this more resilient structure of a web, in a way. And that I think is one big theme here, that naturally grown relationships are more resilient, and probably the best way of building a resilient society compared to the rigid structures that nation states and other forms, or companies and so forth, can impose on us. So that's one thing that I think is quintessential when you read this book, is that constellation web structure that is underlying the whole thing. And well, as I said, is something we might want to explore for the future of mankind when it comes to building societies, having them on a similar model. The next one is about choice, and about finding new ways of making actual considered choices and finding new ways for the future. That's obviously something that Ian McDonald has always been thinking about. Well, he's a science fiction writer, so big deal, right? And the choice thing comes across here in, once again, many layers, because while we have, on the one hand, very clear ideas and very clear groups at the beginning, what happens over time is they are, well, coming together into very new and unique forms. One of those, for example, is the question of gender, and this is obviously a very interesting work when it comes to gender identity and gender expression, which, good on Ian McDonald for actually getting it very well, as far as I can tell. I'm obviously fairly standard cis-hetero male guy, but the way he does deal with it is interesting. So we have, on the one hand, the idea of a choice, where the Hopeland kids are just kids, or, well, they use the German word kind, well, they're just a kid, until they decide which gender they want to be. And while that at the beginning is just, well, either a boy or a girl, which they decide to be at some point in their lives, it kind of becomes more complicated later on when Adley Stormtalker decides that his genders are different. And, well, I thought it was extremely well done when he has his two genders, one of them being well, classic male, his and he, and then another one with a neopronoun, which he calls hey, and is something you might probably call otherkin. I'm not an expert on these kind of genders, but it's just a natural thing that people accept, and that might be important for the future of humanity to figure out, well, steps beyond the simple binary. We obviously have other characters in this world, especially when we come to the kingdom of Avau, that also fall outside the gender binary, and it's just well integrated into this story to show us that sometimes, well, these old structures need to be left behind because they don't necessarily represent us as who we are and who we want to be, and maybe prevent us from evolving into something that we might want to be and or maybe need to be in the future. I think that's just like another one of these aspects that make this book so good, is exactly this tendency of having something between binaries, of the tendency of having something new in the future. And that's, as I said, another brilliant step of building up the story, because at the beginning, you also have, well, you have the people in what is still now Greenland and the people in Avau, but the future will be something beyond that when they merge. And we have the, obviously, the final coda, which is set like 1,000 years in the future, and people are very much post-human at that point. And I think having that step is a very interesting and unique one to see how we slowly move down that direction, which is more or less inevitable if we want to adapt and stay sort of alive. All right. Another one reason that I think makes this book very interesting, very powerful, is the idea of time. See, Ian McDonald, being a science fiction writer, he's obviously very much interested in the idea of science fiction and future and how we deal with the future, which he does in very interesting ways. And there's some wisdom there when he talks about, well, Brightborn and the music, the idea of having a piece of music that will play for 1,000 years, the idea that we are relatively good of looking into the past and building up a sense of the past, but failing at building up a sense for the future. And that is, of course, a huge problem if we're considering global problems like, say, climate change and other of the crises that we've maneuvered ourselves into without a sense for the future. And Ian McDonald trying to do that is fascinating. He finds models like building having the music play for 1,000 years, growing a new forest in Iceland, planning these things that will take measurable time for the future, finding ways to measure that time. And, well, science fiction writing is another one of these ways of trying to establish a sense of the future. And I think Ian McDonald is very craftily mixing those things in, like by practicing what he does here. He's very much doing the thing that he's also writing about, and that he has well noticed as an issue with our, well, maybe even ability to deal with the future is, well, not being able to think about it. So that's another aspect that makes this book very powerful in that regard. But, well, there's obviously more. And, you know, the fact that we're talking about a story that starts in the past, our past, that being 2011, moves through our present all the way into our future, I think does also do that, because it slowly shifts that. It's very interesting to see once you realize that you've moved from the past into the future within that story, because you can't hardly fully pinpoint that moment. And that's an interesting aspect that will probably be even more fun to realize in, like, I don't know, 5 years when you read the same book, because then that point has obviously shifted further to the future. Now, let's move on to the so-called topic, that obviously being climate change and how we deal with it, and why I think this book does a lot of things very well that other authors have also tried, and we'll obviously come back to, once again, Ministry for the Future, and obviously also Termination Shock, which I talked about in earlier videos. If I remember to actually link them down below, I will probably do that, because I talked about them back in the day. So, why do I think this is a very good climate change novel for the year 2023? On the one hand, it does deal very well with, well, the effects of climate change, moving away from just rising sea levels, although they are obviously an element here. It does look at, you know, stuff like mega storms that we have like more and more of. It looks at well, the melting of the ice caps around Greenland and Iceland. It does also very well integrate how these things affect certain communities. And I think that's an important aspect, because so often in climate change debates, we look at mostly like us out here in the West, in the Northwest, and how things are kind of bad. But McDonald goes further, especially with the, both the plots set on Greenland and mostly on Avau, the way these countries are already suffering from climate change, the way they are exploited at the same time by the system, that being capitalism, especially in Avau, where the only freshwater source is, well, bottled by Nestle and sold to other people, the way the island can only live and survive through tourism that will absolutely destroy its environment until, well, obviously the whole place gets destroyed later on. And the way how in certain communities in the global south, the systems are exploited by the West, but also how they co-opt oftentimes rulers, in this case the older king of Avau, to help and be complicit in that exploitation of their land, because they get sort of, well, they get paid off and sort of get the right to play part, or at least partake somewhat in that Western system of exploitation, while their people suffer even more. So I think it's an important aspect to see how that is well integrated. And McDonald finds good ways to just like generally showcase that, how you have an entire economies being completely dependent on these tourists, while also suffering from the fact that they're all dependent on these tourists because it's all they have at this point. I think that's an interesting wrinkle to it, that, for example, Termination Shock and the Ministry for the Future did not necessarily touch upon, because, well, the Ministry for the Future had more like an agrarian aspect to it, with its focus on Africa. There's obviously more to that, and I think the next part is the idea of climate change and how societies don't really fully react with this. And the way that McDonald's does this well is by focusing on these people of Avau mostly, and, well, the different people in Greenland, who are also taking over this place as a colonized place. Let's not forget that Greenland is still officially part of Denmark today, and is basically a colony, or, well, can be seen as a colony in this regard. So it does always have that idea of colonialism, which is capitalist exploitation, in the background. And once we have the climate refugees, which is definitely something we already have, we'll have more, and the way society deals with these climate refugees, the way that, well, China tries to, claim them as citizens, to, well, add them to their system. The US tries to deal with them as refugees and not recognize them as a nation, because it's once again doing the US "we hate refugees" thing. Russia trying to use it to leverage to gain, actual ground on Greenland, to use it for geopolitical maneuvering. There's, in very small hints and pieces, there's a lot of proper analysis of how the global power structure at the moment is functioning built in there. Plus, of course, the general idea that everyone is scared of refugees, which, yeah, fuck you. People are not leaving places because they want to. It's because they need to, for all kinds of reasons, and the way of just reducing them to a mass of people that we could look down upon and manage and so forth is taking away their humanity, and focusing that whole plot on the refugees, trying to keep their culture, trying to keep a culture alive that we as humanity, but mostly us in the West, have basically destroyed by, fucking up the planet, is a really powerful step. And that story on the boats later on, including the attempt to go through that passage, is it northeast passage? I keep confusing those two, through the ice on like a cruise ship. That's some very powerful, intense writing there, even though it's, on a cruise ship. It's fascinating how he does that, and makes sure that the idea is keeping these societies, or these aspects of society, which are once again human relations, how that is so powerful and so important, and will be the thing that will keep us as humans human, because at the end of the day, these relationships within constellations, networks of families, that's what will keep us human up to a point. And then we obviously have the contrast to, the last spasms of the old system with our, crypto bro, Sindri Olafursson, which is an interesting storyline, which I personally really appreciated. Because it shows that there are some people, well, obviously tech billionaires that want to, build their own survival thing where they can live according to, their riches that they have plundered from the world. In this case, it's a seastead called Oceania, where they want to live outside of everything, just keep even more money and so forth, while the rest of the world goes to hell. And it's one of the things that I found somewhat troubling with, say, Ministry for the Future. Its focus on the crypto blockchain carbon coin, but then, that's written like 3 or 4 years ago, and people can be forgiven for thinking that blockchain technology does actually do something useful. Whereas, luckily, Ian McDonald has seen through that and goes, well, it's worthless effort just to create more monetary value, which is not what we need right now. And it's very interesting to see how that pops up again and again, because that temptation is always there. And giving into that grift early, for example, by giving people room for server farms or whatever, can give people or groups or a society or a state or nation the money they need to save themselves from the ravages of climate change. But it's only them, it's not us together, and it will always be built on the individual exploitation of further nature and so forth by individuals for personal enrichment. And seeing that and putting that in there is very interesting, because it also shows that people that have given into that mindset are very hard to turn around to convince, and will always further strive to gain more personal riches, and are just incapable to understanding that more humane approach to changing society into the further future, which once again, brilliantly done there, including the idea that everyone on Oceania gets killed and robbed and murdered, because if you build a society that's all about the gaining of wealth, of personal monetary wealth, people will do that with any means necessary, and sometimes that's violence and crime. And I think it's nice that this shows up. But it's not necessarily like a large part of the story. It's just like one strand in that story web that is Hopeland, and makes it so powerful. Obviously, we also need to talk about love before we end this, and music, and Tesla coils, because we haven't talked about that yet. Because at the end of the day, there is also, the love between Raisa and Eamon, which is kind of damned or not, or cursed or not, with these slightly supernatural, maybe magical realism elements in there. But the idea that, that love can happen in a flash, and that love, whatever comes off it, will always start a new thread in that web of people, in a way, I think is a very powerful one. To give into those intuitions, to give into our spur of the moment feelings, in a way, and see and make it up as we go along from that point onwards, which is one of those things that show up in the book, when he says making shit up as we go along is one of humanity's greatest strengths. Having that as a positive feeling in there, I think, is powerful. And also having these different approaches, the very spontaneous electric approach of the electromancers playing with Tesla coils, which is, a fantastic and fun idea and really cool, and wouldn't make its own story if for a lot of other authors, having just like Tesla coil electromancers battling over London. That's a story right there. Or on the other hand, the Brightborns, who are very inward focused on themselves and just on that grace and curse. Just focused on that one thing which is keeping the music alive, and both are approaches to keeping or building a future. But it's the combination of those two. It's the combination of having one specific goal to work towards, which is keeping the music going and keeping that thing alive, while paying the price for one's good luck up to a point, which is once again a great symbol for how, or allegory for how we in the West have always had charmed lives, but someone is always paying the cost for that. Having that in there, which also works on like a more like Greek tragedy level almost, while on the other hand having that sprawling family of the electromancers doing a more aggressive thing out there, and well, are more spread out. But it's the combination of the two that actually builds the future and makes for a really interesting love story, which ends up, and this is once again a powerful thing, it ends up in a, well, polyamorous story with both Finn and Raisa on the Hopeland side, and Eamon, and we don't know where the future will bring them. But it's once again, it's these alternative forms of living which are maybe more powerful than the classic nuclear family that we have so focused on for oftentimes reasons that are not necessarily as natural as they are proclaimed to be. And I think that's at the heart of this novel. That's at the heart of Hopeland, which is, well, a novel about hope, but also a novel about like figuring out who we really are, and maybe realizing that some of the things we have taken along as traditions, things that we have called natural, or maybe not as natural, just giving ourselves the freedom to choose who we really want to be and figure out where to go, and, well, thinking about people, as humans, and not as whatever bits or pieces within a machine. And that may just help us getting through, well, the obviously very, very dark and rough times that are ahead, because climate change is going to happen no matter what we do right now, and we might want to figure out how to do this as people, and not just as individuals with our billionaire bunkers somewhere, because those people, they're lost at the end of the day. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Hopeland. Go read it. It's a brilliant book, and I want to talk with you about it. And it's a shame that no one talks about it. It's sad. It's a powerful novel. It made me cry numerous times. It made me laugh. It's brilliant, and I wish more people wouldn't hear about it. So that's my thoughts. I hope you had fun. I'll talk to you very soon about something else. If you want to support me, I don't know, like, subscribe, do the things, give me some money. There's some links down below. If you really want to help me out, I can use it right now. It's not a good time in that regard. But mostly, read the book and let's talk about it, because I'm enthralled and I need people to talk to. And until the next one, once again, thanks and cheers.